What's up, everybody? Hello, and welcome to another edition of Downtime with Initiative Roles. My name is Richard E. Darshwood. I am the host of this show and also the instructor, I guess you could say, at Initiative Roles, where we do improv training for dungeon masters and players of the game Dungeons and Dragons. Today, I want you guys to hold on to your socks or get ready for them to be just blown right off, because we've got a really fantastic guest, good friend of mine. He's been a dungeon master to me, and he's also a player in one of my games. We go back and forth. We share so much information. When I first decided I was going to do these kind of podcasts and interviews and stuff, he was at the top of my list, and he finally agreed to say yes. So here he is today to tell us give us some like advanced information, I think. But for those of you who are new to the game or consider yourselves beginners or just getting started or whatever, listen to this all the way through, come back to it again later. This is one of those things that I think anybody who is a dungeon master will want to listen to this over and over again and get a little bit more details, because my friend Logan here, he's been playing the game for a very long time. He's got a very in-depth and personal, passionate opinion of ways to make the game more immersive and create a really intense experience for your players. And that's what we're going to dive into here. Without further ado, hi, Logan. How are you, sir? How are you feeling today?
Doing great, Darsh.
Excellent, cool. So you've been playing for a very long time, and I always ask everybody, how'd you get into it? I think your story is kind of similar to a lot of people, but you started with a very early edition of Dungeons and Dragons at a young age, right?
Absolutely. I started with the original red box basic Dungeons and Dragons set. I want to say 1982, 83, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, and if I remember the story correctly, it wasn't you that actually owned the game. It was just a friend of yours, and you guys sat around playing.
Yep.
What was the experience like the first time around?
Yeah, it was my best friend Tommy, who is still part of my game to this day. He introduced me with a few of his friends. I think they were part of his soccer team, if I remember correctly. We were maybe around 11, 12 years old. We broke it open, played Keep on the Borderlands. I'm pretty certain we did it entirely wrong. I seem to remember.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Throwing like fistfuls of 20-sided dice, which I now know could not possibly have been within the rules.
But that's what's so fun about it. When you're a kid, you don't really know what it's just I mean, you're just having fun. I remember that basic set, and I had no idea what I was doing. I certainly was Thaco part of that set? I don't believe it was. Was it?
No.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Matter of fact, you couldn't even play. Of course, most of you know this, but you couldn't even play like a race and a class. You were either a fighter, right, a cleric, an elf, a halfling. So, being an elf is the equivalent of being a cleric. It's not, you couldn't be an elven cleric.
Right.
Kind of unusual rules, but they were inventing the game. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, it's taken a long time to get where we are today, and it's still evolving, and every single table's different, which is kind of one of the things I want to talk to you a little bit later is, some of the things that you bring to your personal table, the house rules that you've introduced and whatnot, because you have a very in-depth approach to certain rulings to make it a little bit more of a realistic feel for your players. Now, I wanted to kind of talk more about the sandbox style of gaming that I've experienced in your games, and the kind of game that I'm trying my best to run as well. But you have also ran modules and published adventures before. What's your take on the two versus each other?
Well, I love both of them. It really depends on the gaming table. If I've got a dedicated group that I can count on to show up to each of the weekly games, then Sandbox tends to be better for that formula. But if I've got a group that, because most of us are adults and we recognize that sometimes Bob can't make this week and Mary can't make the next week. So I find that modules tend to work really well in those cases, because if somebody can't show up, you just play on.
Mm-hmm. And so that's interesting too. One thing I noticed that's kind of unique in sitting at your table is that when somebody doesn't make it to the game, you've got kind of an interesting house rule and how to approach that. Like some of us, may want to try and role play that particular person's character. We may try and find a way to work into the story why that character isn't there, but you don't really feel the need to deal with that. And hoping you can tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Certainly. I have found that when years later we're looking back at a certain campaign and you're remembering certain battles with your character and the way that whole thing played out, that if that 1 week one of your players can't make it, you don't really remember those details unless you throw in some weird story that doesn't make sense. Like if you're missing a character because one of them can't make it this week, and so you're trying to figure out this whole thing where maybe they're sitting in the sidelines or they get lost by themselves in the dungeon for a little while and then they come back. It works, but at the same time, it really messes with continuity of the game. I find that it's best to just have kind of a unwritten contract with the group that we just kind of look the other way and we just don't worry about the fact that they're not there at that game. Because if next week they pop right back into the game, then if you play it the whole time, then later then later on, years later, months later, when you're looking back on it, you won't quite remember that that person wasn't there for the battle with the Lich or the battle with the dragon. You just kind of assume, well, I guess he was there. But the point is, it doesn't really matter. And
Right.
to put a lot of pressure on, especially as a DM, for a long time, I would do exactly that with trying to figure out what makes sense, or maybe I'd take over as the DM. I'd treat them like an NPC. But there's all kinds of problems that happen. Like, what if they die?
Right.
If the moment you give the character some kind of immunity because the player is not there, you're really kind of messing with the game. So I find so much better to just try it. Just ignore the fact that they're not there. Play on like normal, especially in module situations where you're really not trying to keep a real hardcore storyline with real deep plot. And the sandbox things, I tend to do that a little bit less, but it even works in that case.
Yeah, for sure. Since I have been blessed to be able to sit at your table, I think I've only missed 1.5 sessions in total. Half a session because I had to leave early. And then the only other one that I missed, I was out of town on vacation. And I remember getting text messages from the people at the table about how insane this particular session was going. I was on vacation, getting pissed off at the fact that I wasn't sitting at that table. But the really cool thing about that is that we have a lot of downtime interaction on our Facebook group. And when it came time to kind of recap or discuss things that are happening in between sessions, I got included as though my character was there the whole time. It was a little tricky because I didn't know the details of what had happened leading up until the time that we got together and I could get filled in entirely. But I thought that was really, really cool that you included my character, as though he was there the whole time, even though, my character wasn't involved in any of the fights necessarily at the time. But like you just said, we just remember it as though he was. And that I treasured that a lot. That was really cool.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So when we talk about sandbox style, how do you define a sandbox campaign?
Well, my biggest mindset when it comes to a good sandbox game is based off of my personal favorite way to play a game, and that is immersion, where I always kind of wanted to imagine that if I've got a character, no matter what that character is, and no matter what I've designed his personality to be or his background, any of that, I always kind of enjoy the idea of stepping into a world and for a little while kind of believing it's real. And I mean, not literally, but obviously to be able to play the game and ask yourself, well, what would I do? How would I handle this situation? And the more the game feels like it is not pandering to me, the more that I'm stepping into an environment that really doesn't care if I'm there. Then that's exactly what I enjoy in a good role-playing game. How would I handle this problem? How would, maybe it's not even a giant plot. Some of my favorite games don't involve saving the world, but they're just really, I've decided I'm going to go left down this road and, see if I can't make my fortune. And I think that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed about DMing a really good sandbox game is if you as a DM could step back and just have the world react to what the players do, but don't design the game specifically for them. I'm not saying I don't design encounters that would be interesting for them or throw deep plots, but one of my favorite things to do is in my DM notebook is I'll have like a dozen or so ideas. And every once in a while, just have an NPC mention something. And if the characters decide to go crazy with it, then, I'll play out the rest of that game night. But then I've got a clue about what we really need for this adventure. We will go back and like 2 weeks later or a week later, depending on the game, we come back and I now have a bunch of information that I did not have when I had the barkeep mention some dungeon where a bunch of things are going wrong in a certain area of the country.
For sure.
delay is one of my biggest tactics. Once I realize that players have taken one of my one of the hooks that I've thrown.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, because I think that's a great tool that every dungeon master really should have, and it's something I'm still learning myself.
All right. Now, are you talking about the actual notebook or how I do the?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, definitely. Yeah, I would love to hear you tell more about the notebook. This is great.
Okay, well, I'll start with the thing with the notebook is that first of all, I have a different notebook for any group that I'm playing. If I'm a player, I've got a notebook. If I'm a dungeon master in 3 different games, I've got 3 different notebooks. But if I'm doing a sandbox, first thing I do is I get a notebook, and at the very beginning, I fill it with the details that may not be important to the characters, like most role players could give a crap less about what the month is or what the actual date is. You probably got somebody who's wanting to know the exact details. It's usually me in your game. But do things like list out all of the holidays, list out the months, list out the different coins, the names of the different countries that are in the area. But basically, I fill the very beginning up with like a reference for all of the important things a sandbox story should know. Because even though you don't necessarily want to track every single day, it is a good idea that if you know that Shield Meet is happening in a week, that you don't just wait till that actual day in the game and say, guess what? You show up in town and it's the Shield Meet festival. That's not how holidays work. Holidays, the month leading up to it, that's all everybody's talking about. And the reason why I do that kind of stuff is the more you give the players what they're kind of used to here, the more they're going to play it as if it's real. Like if they're constantly hearing about the harvest coming up, when they're handed coins, they're not just handed silver pieces, they're handed royal falcons. Even if your game system doesn't really follow a very specific thing on that, the more you, as a DM, give them those little details, just throw them in the story. You don't have to have them track it as silver falcons. Just have it mentioned. The NPC say things like that. Those are the kind of things that really bring out a sandbox. And that's what I use my notebook for, to track those kind of details.
Yeah, essentially you're fleshing out the world, and whether it's a campaign that's already, setting, I should say, that's already been published or, thought up by, creator years ago even, or if it's a world that you're creating. I love the idea of the coins specifically because it's something that I don't think anybody really takes time to think about. Holidays seem, or they should seem obvious, but the coins are something funny that just adds a little extra flavor to the game. And what you mean by that, of course, is, Royal Falcons being a silver piece, or, I think in Forgotten Realms, you have dragons for gold pieces, unicorns for platinum pieces, et cetera, et cetera.
A lot of people don't even know that Forgotten Realms, they actually have names for their coins.
Precisely, right. But it helps you immerse into that world a whole lot better, because this is the way people would talk if they're referring to it. They're not going to say 100 gold pieces, just like when you go to Great Britain, you're not even going to have people, say $100. They're going to say 100 pounds, right? So it just kind of creates a more realistic feeling. Say it again. Sorry.
They're just little reminders that this
precisely. World. Yeah, hell yeah. And so adding to that, I know that you have what I call a really great system or formula for fleshing out this world. Explain that to us a little bit.
Okay, you and I talked about this the other day, obviously. Yeah. So it's I know I might have gotten caught off guard because normally I don't. I haven't written this out in any great detail, but I have explained it to dozens of game masters over the years as a system for how to recognize the importance of things. So some of you may have been shown the classic time, I forget what they refer to it as, but basically how to manage your own time with the idea of a bucket with some rocks, where you put the largest rocks in first and then the medium rocks and small rocks and so on. Well, I've used that kind of mindset for gaming. So what I do is I've got a system where I basically rank ideas and level of detail from 1 to 5. And for the purpose of this, let's just say 1 is your large rocks. It is your big ideas. If you're in a culture, there are things that everybody in the culture is aware of. There's a famine. There is a major war that's on everybody's minds. Well, these would rank as things as level 1 details to keep in mind as a dungeon master about your environment. Level 2 starts being larger things that are more localized, all the way down to a rating 5, which would be the micro details, like the exact name and nature of people. Where like ranking 4 would be the stats that as a dungeon master you might care about. Now, where this is applicable is when you're running your game. The biggest mistake I see with a lot of game masters are they focus so much on details that all of a sudden the party decides to turn left when you were trying to get them to turn right, and you don't know what to do. Well, if you have, while you're sitting around coming up with ideas, if you start with the big rocks first, you start with your number 1 big things, you got the war going on, you got the famine going on, the level 2 things. There is a local problem where people are going missing. These are important, but you don't have to flush them out yet. You don't have to make out the details of why or how. So imagine that you've got some basic notes for your campaign. The ones are really things that every once in a while you just throw in something new, because almost all of those come in gradually. But what I will tend to do is if all of a sudden the party is coming into a town and they're talking to different people and I throw several different hooks, well, those are really, level 2 ideas. They're just things that I haven't flushed out necessarily, and I don't bother fleshing them out because I have no idea if they're going to go with it. But the moment they do, then I will, because I've got a whole bunch of little side things that can happen. Maybe sometimes just a simple fight solves it, because if you got a 2 or 3 hour game night, you let them finish off a good battle, and then you go home, because now, like I said earlier, you know which hook they're going to run with. Mm-hmm. And then you take an idea that's only a medium rock and you start adding details, getting it all the way to your level 4 stuff where you've got the exact stats of enemies and you picked several fights, and really just depends. But that's why I'll see DMs will have an NPC that they will decide every detail about them, and then that NPC is never used. Well, that's a level 5 like the tiniest rock, the detail. It's important the moment that person's in front of the players. So you got to have those.
Yeah.
If you're not certain that they're going to meet that person yet, then that's really a lot of effort that you could have used building up a bunch of other activities that are going on in the area.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. So the concept is, kind of circling back a little bit to the concept of the jar with the rocks. And, this creates a really good visual for someone who's trying to learn this concept. I'm remembering the video that I saw where it was like some philosophy professor or something like that. He's got his big jar, like big, huge mason jar, or, humongous thing, like a gallon sized jar, fills it up with a bunch of rocks, and there's still plenty of space in there. So the thing isn't full yet. So then you add smaller rocks and you kind of work those in there. It's still not quite full. You can add sand. And then finally, he may have even added water. I don't even remember. But the idea was, this is, how you should work your time, so that you're filling up all your time, and make sure that you're focusing on the big things first and then work on the little things. And that's what you're talking about, is filling a jar with big details for this immersive world that you're putting your players in. And then when you're talking about your notebook, when you make your notes, you actually number some of these, things that you're jotting down as far as what's happening in this world, and you rate them essentially as like how important they are, how big or small they are.
Exactly. And sometimes it's less about importance. Like when I was talking about the calendar or the coin system earlier, I actually put those, even though those are details, I actually rank them as 1, because they are things that everybody is aware of. And even though they are exact details, they're details that I can have ahead of time. You don't have to constantly look at your book and go, okay, it's this certain day. Who cares? If you're traveling over land, just make a good estimate. But at a certain point, just come into town and give one of those details. And even though it's unimportant detail for the plot, it's important for the game, because
right.
you are effectively telling the characters that this is a real world.
Yeah. So let's talk about delay. You mentioned it earlier. So we're talking about, and I'm guilty of this all the time, where I spend so much time focusing on the details, because for some reason, when I'm, creating in my mind this story that I envision the players are going to experience, I sometimes forget that it doesn't really matter what my version of the story is and how it plays out, because I'm trying to create this collaborative experience so that everyone drives the story, right?
Right.
So focusing on those big details and not so much on the little ones, it helps make that happen. But let's say we get into a scenario where players decide to take a U-turn or a complete left-hand turn, and you weren't expecting them to at all. And you're not trying to railroad them necessarily, but you're just trying to catch up because you may not have prepared something on that path. So what's your approach to that?
Well, you mentioned the word railroading. There are a lot of opinions pro and against railroading. I only find railroading useful in very short spurts. Like if they're about to enter like they've decided for one reason or another that they're going to go rob that house that really wasn't on my plot plan, so I don't even have a layout yet. I need a delay, so I will use a very short spurt railroad in the form of somebody walks up and swings on the barbarian. That's
Sure.
railroading. That just forced them to deal with something, but it doesn't railroad them into a plot, and that's where, like, I refuse to do railroading. Occasionally, I've had to kind of pause the game long enough to say, "Hey, look, I don't need you guys to go down this route, but I know you guys have been dying for a good classic dungeon scenario, and I threw one over there to the left, so you can do it,
Right.
but I'm not railroading you because I'm fully prepared for going a different route. I only do that if they miss the obvious clues. Like
Sure.
I've thrown all kinds of Scooby snacks on the ground and nobody's eating. A few times I've done that, but I never force them. What I do is I keep in my notebook an area towards the very beginning that I pretty much rank as rating 3 size rocks for the purpose of this. And they are a bunch of little mini hooks, little things that could be interesting. And sometimes I base them off of what I know of my players. Because if I know that one of the players is, a dead sucker for somebody offering to sell their wares, they've just got some stuff they're selling on a blanket on the side of the road. And if I know that, Nick's going to go for that 10 times out of 10, that becomes a really useful delay. I try not to do it where it's entirely focused on one player, but just enough to be able to work out the rest of the game, let them really feel that action happening for the evening. And then I go home, and I always do this after adventure set of notes. Like I always write a whole bunch of little details about here's where they're going, here's where they're likely to go, here's they killed some NPCs. What's the reaction? Was somebody's cousin pissed off about this and wants something done about it? That kind of thing. But the other thing I keep in the notebook is a whole bunch of interesting NPCs, because nothing will capture everybody's interest more than a person interacting with them that isn't someone you got to kill or isn't a harlot in a brothel, although sometimes that's what you have to deal with too. What I find that the best thing to do is have just a whole bunch of interesting NPCs that have their own hooks that aren't your hooks, that's their hooks. And all it takes is you don't even have to have a plan for when you're going to use them. Like I got about 30 of them in my current notebook for your game.
Awesome.
And that if I need them, all of a sudden there's this person kind of stumbles into the situation. You might need to delay a little bit. So you've got a situation where, like, here's an example. Imagine you're in a local town, you're making your way through here, you've got a plan, you're going to cross the other side of the town, you're going to pick a fight with a very specific NPC. You've got this whole thing ready to go, but I don't have your stats yet. Groups walking by, and some domestic dispute happens. The big burly man is like screaming at his wife and dragging her out of the building by her hair, and she's bawling and angry and like pounding on his chest. 10 times out of 10, your group's going to react.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, you just gave yourself 2 hours of game time. And plus, you're probably going to be taking notes throughout the whole thing, going, oh, wow, I can expand on this, because they've taken an interest. Not only are they threatening the guy, don't you ever do that again, but I'm going to be back and making sure. Now, all of a sudden, you get to, in between game weeks, decide to get a map of their immediate neighborhood in case you got to go bust down a door later. The idea is that you have a bunch of these little things that you don't have a specific need for them yet. They're just there in case you need a delay tech.
Yeah, I love that. And it's not even just, conflict necessarily. It could be just adding, different details that for some reason your characters, your PCs may want to investigate.
Lost child.
Yeah.
Just a simple issue. Even well, maybe not the real evil campaigns, but even if you've got a group of characters who are always robbing and stealing and doing all this or that, even those kind of people tend to need a win from time to time that makes them feel like they're still the good guy.
Yeah.
So just a kid holding their teddy bear, looking around and clearly lost in town or in the woods. Most of the time, there's going to be at least one character who says, no, we got to make this our top priority. We've all been in games before where a major plot is ignored just because you want to, you find that you are very fond of an NPC.
Mm-hmm.
That, if anything, they're gonna believe that their character is in a real world for a couple of hours.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I remember, in some of the games where we've enjoyed just going on a hunt. We're traveling through the wilderness and we decide, we're sick of eating rations all the time. Let's go see if we can hunt something. And that turns into, an encounter. It's fun. It's wild. And I see you as a DM, like your eyes light up because you love that kind of stuff too. You love to, to narrate those kind of stories as well.
Yeah, all too often these important things that really matter to these people, a lot of times they just get ignored because we decide, well, I don't really, I don't want to track all that. I don't want to be tracking my food or how often I hunt. I get it, but there's not just one or the other. You don't have to make the choice of either I'm going to count every single coin weight of all the weight of all my equipment and exactly number of arrows and how much food I've got, or completely ignore it. Well, there's a middle ground. You can actually basically completely ignore it, but every once in a while as a DM, remind them that it's part of who they are. We all camp every night in our games and have these watches. We never really talk about how uncomfortable it would be to sleep on the ground.
That's a good point.
That from time to time. I had a game one time where somebody's pillow got stolen by a goblin, and how annoyed he was because he kept having to roll up his jacket and sleep on it, and he didn't realize how important that pillow was. That pillow was more valuable to that player than a +2 axe.
No kidding.
Yeah, it just started role playing, and the more you can get these players to become these characters, the more they're going to remember it. I get it. Most role players are like, oh, let's just keep it. Let's dumb it down. I really am in this for the combat. That's fine. But they're not going to remember those details. They're only going to remember that they beat a Remorax. They're not going to remember why they fought it.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And I can tell you from personal experience, having played in your games, there's so many times where you've made weather a big factor. And I remember sometimes during our travel, commenting in character and like just having dialogue with the other PCs about how crummy this is, that we're walking through this muddy trail. Our boots are soaking wet. I can feel the jungle rot growing in between my toes right now, and it's because you do such a great job of creating that environment. And I think that's what a lot of DMs really should try and focus on is not yourself try and drive the story to the next plot point or the next bullet point on your notes or whatever. Let things kind of grow, let things kind of organically happen, but you have to create the environment. You have to set the pace for them.
Empower them. Empower them. I've had one of my favorite players is Nick from our I know we got a couple of great Nick players in our group, but one of the things that I've really enjoyed about having him in our games is that he has finally realized he has certain freedoms, and all of the players do, but he takes advantage of it. Like he'll say, he'll ask, I want to go get some armor mended, and even though I've never told him his armor was damaged, he was in enough combat that he's decided that the laces or that the straps are busted on his armor, so he goes to get it done. And then when the party shows up, he storms out of there yelling at the guy because they just got in a big argument over money. And I, as the game master, did not push that.
Right.
But oh boy, did I give him inspiration for that.
Heck yeah.
Because the more you empower them, like whatever you do, don't become a control freak with the DM role. I mean, give your characters, give your players a certain amount of freedom to be able to write the story themselves, and not just when they roll a nat 20. That's a mistake. Just because they that your enemy only has 3 hit points left and they just did 12. Don't just say, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do that too.
Sure.
But have them describe the situation from time to time. Sometimes you don't even need to roll the dice. Like if you're fighting a bunch of goblins and it's pretty one-sided, describe it. Just for once, to go into that fight and say, all right, guys, keep your dice put away for this one. This is not a critical part of the plot, but we're going to play this out and do the whole thing from description. You'd be surprised how engaged your players will become. And they'll remember you as a DM because
that's a great idea. I have never tried that before, and I'm tempted to, because then it turns into less of a strategy game and more of a narration storytelling experience.
No. Always remember that each one of your players are there for a different reason, and you cannot just feed your reason.
Yeah, this was one of the huge takeaways that I got from, first talking to you when I started, being a dungeon master, is understanding the players. Do you mind going into that a little bit, talking a little bit more about that?
Everybody plays these games for their own reasons, for different reasons. And if you want to be a great game master, take the time to find out what differentiates each one of them. But don't forget to include yourself. What brings them to the table. Chris might really be there because he just loves the battle. He loves imagining being this great war hero. Maybe where another player like Tom might be really big into strategy. Like it's not just the battle, it's seeing how strategic he can play this out. Another one, Nick, that we just mentioned a bit ago, his favorite thing, actually both of the Nicks actually have this, Nick Murphy and Canfield, they both do this thing where the actual loot at the end of it is the thing that gets them most excited about the game. It's about finding cool treasures. My personal favorites as a player have always been opportunities to think outside of the box, meaning use spells in a way that isn't commonly used, or use spells that aren't commonly used at all. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's always been immersion. Like I want, while I'm in the story, to kind of do everything I can to believe that this is possible. But do that with each one of your characters. You can ask them directly or just pay attention. A good game master will get to the point where you recognize it. But the trick is you can't just feed yourself. You can't just feed the guy in or the girl who in the group who is always talking and always because we all have that player who's the most engaging player. Don't just feed that person. Give everybody. Make sure that if you've got somebody who's about thinking outside of the box, throw some things in there, or but you don't even have to throw things in. Just watch for when they're doing it. And don't automatically make it work. Challenge it. Because if they walk away from it and go, "That was awesome," and especially if their friends are saying, "Wow, I would have never thought to use that way," you just made it where that player wants to be at your table because finally I'm at a table that actually lets me do what I want to do. But you got to be careful because you might have a player there who what that person wants is to be a murder hobo and it's ruining it. So you can't just automatically feed it to everybody. Another thing is you've got to take a time and have a social contract with the players as individuals, but also as a group. You say, look, you were talking a little bit earlier about the worlds, and and I know that in our last time you and I talked, we talked a lot about whether we use canon materials or if we make.
Sure.
Well, sometimes, like what I will do is I'll talk with everybody ahead of time. Say, look, I read a lot about the Forgotten Realms. I know a lot about this. If we're about to come into a town, be sure I'm going to look it up and make sure, understand it. But what's going to happen is I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to find out that there was more information in another book that I haven't read. So we have to make a kind of a social contract here that I need the freedoms to be able to break away from that. Now, no DM needs to ask that, but if you do, they respect that. Mm-hmm. Say, I'm going to do that in return with you as well. If you as a player know some valuable stuff, like Nathan's really good about this, about knowing some of the lore of the world that I've been in it forever, and this kid's half my age and he knows Forgotten Realms better than I do.
Sure.
Give them a social contract as well, and then just say, look, man, talk to me on the side, and if you see that I'm going down the wrong path, and I welcome it, just don't go to the table. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
There's a lot of perks and benefits to using canon material because you don't have to do quite as much homework, if provided that your players, are accepting of, what you're just talking about. But then there's also the perks of doing homebrew or like a complete world building thing where you're creating a whole different setting, and then you can just come up with with all the details on the fly. But of course, you do still want to, and I'm circling back, or backtrack a little bit. You still want to have those big rocks and the smaller rocks of all the details of what's happening. The big thing that I'm hoping people will take away who are listening to this is the importance of having a living, breathing world in which your players are immersed into. And I love that word. And I think it was maybe just few months ago that you had mentioned that word to me, and it kind of made me reevaluate the RPG experience, the word immersion. Because we throw the words out like escapism and fantasy and things like that, and that's all part of it. But what makes it really fun is feeling as though you're immersed in this world. And I liken it a lot to being a magician, which if people watching this don't already know, I make a part-time living as a magician as well. So this kind of comes natural to me, but I would expect it helps a lot of dungeon masters out if they have that verbal contract or that social contract, as you put it, to say, this is a world, we know it's fake, we know we're having to suspend disbelief in order to enjoy it. But if you as a player are willing to, to accept the information that I give you, even if that it might be false, if you're willing to, accept it as it is in this game, then we're going to have a lot of fun,
Yeah.
And I think that's what it comes down to. So I do want to ask you though about inspiration. When you're creating things, obviously there's moments where you're, improvising certain things, but probably a lot of the items in your notebook are driven from certain things that have inspired you. What do you look for to get inspired?
Well, I start by for basic inspiration, obviously it's the classics, the movies, the books that I've read, interesting people, whether I see them on TV or I meet them in real life. Some of those NPCs that I talk about are, based directly off of seeing people and finding something interesting about a personality that I meet.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's also just about interesting little things that I see. I was heading to our game 6 months ago, and I remember I stopped off and got myself a sandwich and was sitting in my car eating it, and I noticed this dog across the street just kind of making its way around, and it could have been a stray. I couldn't really tell. I remember at one point seeing some people go near it, and it just kind of ran off. But there was something about seeing this stray that made me think about how that's life. That kind of thing is part of the stuff that you see every day. So that night at the game, I just had a stray, and even though the guys were going to run over there to feed the dog and all that, it kind of ran off. It had a personality. I decided that I was going to do my best to capture that actual dog's personality.
Sure.
But the real value was that it's not just about a combat stat of a monster or getting your next magic item. It was just that kind of thing that it humanizes the story for you. But I do that with all kinds of things. I see an interesting piece of architecture, or I see a couple people in an argument or something. Sometimes it's just stuff right off the TV. But I also, that notebook is what I use to remember it, unless it's that night, like the dog situation happened an hour before our game. But, what I've done in other situations is like I look for several windows of opportunity where I can just think. And one of them is the drive to or from work. It's about a 40-minute drive, so I use that time. And of course, the obvious, just before you're going to sleep, you're laying there, you're trying to fall asleep. Use that as a time to invent and create.
Yeah.
Just remember to go back to your lab notebook. I call it lab notebook. Engineering is my field, and my notebook. And I make quick little notes about what I just thought about. Don't forget to do this. Don't forget there are accents, and not just the accents that we're all used to here on Earth. Just to do something interesting, like have somebody have an interesting accent, or maybe I just kind of go off on this tangent about a sickness. Like I might say, I heard earlier people talking about the pandemic. I'm going to mention a sickness that's going around in the town that isn't based on a plot.
Sure.
It's literally just a really bad flu that's knocking everybody on their ass.
Yeah.
And the cleric can't seem to do it because I got a few basic things like clerics can't solve the cold no matter how good they are. I will do things like that, and all of a sudden they become accidental red herrings that are awesome to have in a
Right.
story. We got to figure out how to solve this, and they never figure it out, but it feels real because we've all had situations where everybody in the office is sick.
Yeah, there's a really funny thing happens as a DM versus being a player. For me as a DM, I find myself, for good or bad, I don't know yet. I find myself constantly wanting to have every detail that I describe coming together into one focal point. But I think that leads to bad storytelling, because it's kind of like the Star Wars. I keep on thinking about George Lucas and how when he did the prequels, when he did the first movie, he had no idea he was going to do the prequels. So he started like tying all these things together, like C-3PO being the android that was built by Anakin Skywalker. Is like, come on, guys, that's dumb. That's a stupid thing to do. But
he said in other interviews that he had all that planned the whole time, but I didn't buy it.
Yeah, of course. No, totally not. Because that's, yeah. And that's the thing is, when I'm writing details, whether I just throw it out there as an improv thing, later on, when I'm laying down at bed at night and I have those thoughts in my head, just like you're talking about, I'm thinking, how can I tie that together? But it doesn't need to. And that's what I've noticed from playing in your games, that there's a lot of details that you throw out that are still mysteries to me, but I still think about them. Like, I'm still wondering about that redheaded woman that was standing there waving us off and looking at one of the players in our group, like looking at one of the PCs and waving to him as our boat takes off. And I'm like, what was that lady all about? I don't even know if he thinks about it nearly as much as I do, but it drives me crazy. But I don't really want to know either.
But it felt real.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's exactly it. And again, likening it to a magic trick, it's the mystery that makes it exciting. And then, like you just said, it creates a more immersive experience. It makes it feel more real. So that kind of ties into the next thing I wanted to ask you. You've been a dungeon master for a very long time. You've been playing the game as a PC for a very long time. How do you juggle the experience? Like, is there like certain things that you have to turn off, like certain switches? What's that like for you as a player when you have already been a DM for such a long time as well?
Yeah, that one's hard. I handle being a dungeon master a lot better than I do as a player, although I absolutely love being a player. The problem is that it is real easy to, as a player, to kind of want some of the stuff you've given other tables. And because of that, you can't help but find yourself, especially if you're older, where you have little bits of judgment here or there, not just for the dungeon master, but for other players sometimes. Like if you've got a player in your group who is just obsessed with getting the next improvement to their character, but is abandoning the storyline, it can get to the point where it can be very, very difficult. So it really helps to be able to shut that off. Another one that I run into in just about every game I've ever played is that if we're going to play in a certain area, for instance, and I'm familiar with the area, not because I'm doing homework right now, but I know the area. If the game master isn't even going with the big rocks that are described in the canon, then it makes it where all of it feels like it's not real, and it kills the immersion experience for me. For instance, if we come into a major city, for instance, and like Waterdeep, and while we're there, everything about it is just their own twist, then I'm really not playing in the world that I've fallen in love with, and I just have to completely go with disbelief on all of it. I almost prefer to play in worlds where they've invented everything themselves.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of hard to go, well, I know that's not the case, or especially if it's just real life mechanics. If you're, the same city, Waterdeep, and you start asking about normal things like the travel, the amount of merchant travel that's coming into the city, and they say, oh, none. There's like 1 million people in that city.
You didn't read anything about Waterdeep then, did you?
Well, that's not even to do that. I could literally have never played in Waterdeep. If we're playing an invented thing, an invented world, but you're describing a city of 1 million people, all of a sudden that kills the experience. They don't have to be perfect,
Sure.
but sometimes I find that very difficult. So the answer to your question is I have to do my best to remember that even though what I'm after is an immersive experience, the game master might not be driven by that, or maybe inexperienced, or really just wants the control to change everything up.
Mhm.
So I find that's the biggest difficulty is, you know, or if like game masters are handing me everything rather than letting me,
Oh
discover
gosh, yeah.
stuff, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's my hardest thing. I love being a player, but I definitely find that I end up having a lot more game nights. This is since I was a kid. This is not recent, where the enjoyment factor was significantly lower being a player because of that.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I go back and forth. Since I've been a DM, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But it's kind of like the grass is greener. When I'm playing a lot, I kind of miss being a DM, and when I'm DMing a lot, I miss being a player. So I'm happy that I've found that nice balance right now, where I can do a little bit of both throughout the week. We're actually getting ready to jump into a game here in a few hours. You and I are going to be playing side by side. I have no idea what we're getting ourselves into. The excitement is just it's growing inside me as the hours draw near. So I know that we definitely covered a lot of stuff here. And as I said in the beginning of the video, if you're new to the game and you're new to being a dungeon master, this may be a lot to consume, a lot to digest. You might feel like you've bit off a lot to chew on here, but don't worry about that. This is great stuff to soak up in your brain. Think about it at a later time. Come back, watch this video again, get some more details. If you guys have any questions, definitely put them in the comments below, because Logan and I will both be happy to answer them. But having said that, what kind of advice do you have for new dungeon masters, like people that are pretty much a novice at this point? What kind of advice do you give them?
Well, first, remember you're a player at the table too. You may be a player in the role-playing game sense, but you are a player of a game at a table. Don't forget to make sure that you understand what brings you to the table too. So, and there's nothing wrong with making sure that the path that you take as a dungeon master also adds to your own personal enjoyment. Understand that there is no right or wrong way to play this game as long as people are having fun. So the things that I say don't really matter if they don't apply to your table. The thing where I was talking about knowing why each of your players are at the table, that is key. That really, really is. If you don't understand what they love about role-playing games in general, you're not going to be able to provide a game that is memorable and enjoyable to them.
Yeah.
But more than anything, don't put a bunch of weight on your shoulders that's unnecessary. If you've watched a bunch of Critical Role and you come back as a dungeon master and somehow feel I can't keep up with that,
Sure.
It's a ridiculous mindset. I love Mercer's games as much as anybody, but I don't hold myself to that standard. If anything, in some ways, I decide that that's not how I want to play the game.
Yeah.
Accept that.
Yeah, I think probably the best DMs are the ones that are self-aware and realizing that they have room to grow, try new things, no matter how long you've been doing it. Someone like Mercer, I wouldn't say that he holds a bar necessarily. He just has a different way of doing a different play style, and it works great for the voice actors that are playing in his games, that can easily bounce those, can easily improv with him, and they have they've definitely found a nice niche and a nice flow. They play well together, but that may not work at your table, and that's why if you listen to a lot of different actual play shows, whether on YouTube or if you subscribe to certain streaming platforms, you'll see a lot of different styles in dungeon masters and players. Every group is different. So you hit it on the head perfectly. As long as you're having fun, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. And look
100.
for cases where one of your players isn't having fun.
Yeah.
That's something else that I see way too often is it becomes obvious that one of the players is not enjoying something. You don't have to make the game, you don't have to cater it to them, especially if their style doesn't work. As a player, I've run into the situation a few times where I eventually have to realize that I'm the one who isn't enjoying the game, and I can't really ask that table. It's the wrong kind of table to play an immersion style game.
Sure.
And there's nothing wrong with it. If every one of them is basically, let's just say the whole group is a bunch of fans of anime, and they really want this game where their characters can leap 30 feet in the air and carry swords that are physically larger than they are. I can't say that there's anything wrong with that, but I have every right to realize at a certain point that that's not my table.
Sure.
Don't be afraid to walk away from a table.
Yeah,
Just
that makes sense.
do it out of anger. These people are probably your friends.
Yeah, that's great advice too. Yeah.
But don't force yourself to play a style that you can't get your head around.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And real briefly, because I wanted to make sure that we touched on this, but I didn't have it in my notes. You mentioned it briefly, and I just wanted to make sure, because I think it's great advice that you've given me as far as, understanding your players and their preferences. Is there anything that you do or could advise somebody as a dungeon master who has a player that may not seem so engaged in the game? Is there anything that you've ever had to deal with in the past where you've tried different things to, kind of get them to come out of their shell a little bit, or just let it happen on its own?
Yes, I've got a few pages in my notebook. I always, for some reason, I've gotten the habit of putting this in the back of my notebook, so it's real fast to get to. That way I don't have to go through and find a tab. Because they're just like how the front of my notebook is dedicated to a bunch of details about the world that I may need to reference really fast, like the calendar months or whatever.
Sure.
The back of it is dedicated to those players. And I usually leave like a half a page for each one of them for any kind of notes. And if I did find a player that was struggling with staying focused, then I make it a point to make notes about when that doesn't happen. Like if all of a sudden the character is on his phone, all of a sudden leans forward and gets involved, and it's not even because they're being engaged with directly. It just maybe like one of my favorite traits of yours, something that I clearly recognize as a dungeon master that you love, is characterization, the personality of an NPC. If you notice at a table, and obviously virtually it's harder to tell, but if you notice at a table that same character's player sets his phone down and has a grin on his face every time you're playing out an NPC, then you've found a way to capture that.
Yeah.
Don't lose track of that. Track those kind of things. Also, sometimes just if you get a chance, especially after the pandemic is over, go have a sandwich with them and don't confront them about it. Just go and just get in a station to be talking about, man, that was a lot of fun. And don't even bring up, hey, I noticed sometimes you're not engaged. No, that just puts them on the defensive.
Right.
Just get them talking, and sometimes they'll start, going into what they got them excited. The other thing is also, and this one was really, really hard for me to understand because it's an exact opposite personality trait of mine. I have found that some people get extremely engaged, but kind of stare off into space the whole time. And you find out later that they love the game, that this is their favorite thing, but they're just not actively engaging you. Consider always that there is the possibility that person is just simply not like you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You mean not similar to you?
Yeah, I don't mean you. Just mean if like your gaming style is, I'm always involved, I roll my initiatives, I get this and that, and you notice this person isn't, it might be that they are enjoying the game and they're fully engaged and they are getting what you want. Because if you achieve the goal that I was talking about earlier about understanding what brings the players to not just your table, but to tables in general, to gaming table, you might figure out that player, this is normal behavior for them.
Yeah.
But if you find that some people really aren't paying close attention, like we've got a gamer on our table who doesn't really put a lot of work into learning all the rules, but seems to love the story. Who cares?
Yeah.
I would personally struggle with understanding that. I'm like, the game's not that hard. Learn the rules. But at the same time, if that player is engaged every time there's NPCs that are interesting, or all of a sudden we're about to try to figure out the plot, and you notice that guy is always right on the money. He's really figuring out your plots. There's value to that. I know that the player I'm thinking of usually is the first one to figure out what's going on.
Dude, I know. Yeah. And he doesn't always tell us either. He knows, and he might share some notes with you. It's yeah.
Yeah, or he'll spring it on you at the very end. It was this guy who did it the whole time, and I'm over here going, I didn't even get a clue that you figured that.
Right.
You know, so understand that. Just always remember that other people's playing style might be completely different. But if you find out that they're not having fun, if that's the reason, if they're like, I'm not having fun because it seems like this or that, or especially if you got like a player at your table who is like a hog of the podium, you know, then sometimes the whole reason why somebody's not engaging is because of another player is always speaking up and being that person. That's what I was pointing to make your game situation. So you and I were talking about our game recently where I muted myself just so I wouldn't answer, because I was able to figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
But there were other players who weren't speaking up as much, and I realized I don't need to be the hog of the show. As a DM, sometimes you got to talk to that person and go, hey, like, and again, don't bring out their flaw. Instead, like, hey, you have any ideas on how we can get this player to be a little more involved? Because I can see that they're just wanting to.
Yep.
And all of a sudden you empowered them. You didn't even call them out. And I know from experience, because I am sometimes that player at the table, that if a DM kind of lets me off the hook and was to bring it up that way, and in my head I'm going, it's because of me, I'm the one who's always doing that, then I take that as such a really great thing the game master did. He didn't call me out, and instead asked for my assistance on something, and it paid off because I know I was just kind of playing, but it was so worth it because there's not that embarrassment of Logan, I need you to please let somebody else lead from time to time.
Sure. I have personally seen so much value in keeping communication going between the players and myself in between games is what I mean. We have, gosh, it seems like in the game I'm running that you're in, I think there's probably half of the people in that group that have experience or are currently a dungeon master. And so I love chatting with them and getting ideas. And when it started, the idea, my purpose in doing so was to get advice from one dungeon master to another. Like, let me know what you think. You're playing in my game. I want to know what you would do differently. I'd love to hear some ideas. But I've also talked to the players, and I feel like there's great value in that as well. It's really important, just like you said, not to call out somebody's flaws, but to make them feel empowered and, ask them on, certain thought-provoking questions, and, get inside the player's mind and understand what is bringing them to the table and what you can do to make it a better experience for them and everyone else.
Yeah, and I've found that before that the more you engage with those players, especially the ones who are really loving it, the more they're willing to allow the game to go down a path that they might not have originally. Like one of the things I really enjoy about some of our players from the Sunday group that I run is that there have been times where I call Tom aside and say, hey, look, this plot's about to get real interesting. Are you willing to have your character die? He's like, I'm on board with that. And he loved this character. And it ended up being a situation where it wasn't even about dice rolls. I didn't even adjust dice rolls or anything. It's literally a situation where the group comes into camp and he's dead.
Yeah, dude.
And they have to go from there. And or I've had other situations where I've even pulled you aside to do some of this before.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I need you to do something for me.
Sure.
You're under a spell. I need you to try to do your best to kill the party.
Sure.
And those players will be like, screw it, I'm on board, because now this is becoming memorable.
Yes.
And everybody at the table is going, oh my God, Darsh is trying to kill me. He's a player, but he's under a spell. What do I do? And they have to answer those questions. And there's no doubt in a million years that your character could die in this situation, because Darsh is going to kill you.
For sure.
Yeah, so and I use that kind of stuff. Break away from the game just long enough. It's not railroading if you have a chat with them ahead of time to say, look, or let's just say you want somebody else to get something. Like you have a player who always picks up the cool magic items. Even if you just get a hold of them and say, do me a favor, don't pick this item. just have because you're empowering them. You're putting them in a role that's part of the DM experience.
Yeah.
And they love that stuff.
You're bringing them behind the veil of the curtain, that behind the backstage, sort of, so to speak. In Magic, we call those people Confederates or shills. And it's the same thing. And they love being a part of it. And as a player who's, been a part of that, I loved it too. I think anyone that I've, even almost done that with on some of our players, like barely done that. I haven't, really doubled down on it just yet, but I may end up at some point. But they've all been all for it. Everyone wants to be a part of that.
And they get to feel like they are better at this.
Yeah, that's true too.
Never forget that DMs and players very much want their peers to believe that they are good at this.
Sure.
Way too often people forget that. But at the same time, you got to be careful as a DM and as a player. Ask yourself, how much effort am I placing into trying to convince everybody I'm good at this?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the path goes wrong. So as often as possible as a game master and as a player, try to respect the other players. Remember that if you call them out, you're also kind of saying, hey, this thing that you love to do, you're not very good at. And that's painful.
Yeah.
So you're only hurting your table when you do that.
Right. Yeah. Well, damn, man, this has been a ton of great advice in a short period of time. I mean, we've covered almost an hour doing this stuff. And as with any time that I get to talk with somebody about Dungeons and Dragons, we start with one topic and then veer into a whole nother one. But it's always great. So blessed to have you as a dungeon master and a player. I'm blessed to have had you for this hour to share, at least a chunk of the wealth of information you have inside your brain with our viewers. And I know that you gotta jump off here because you got some projects that you're working on. But real quick, just a curiosity, what are the projects that you got coming up?
Oh, the stuff I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
It's actually fulfilling some customer orders. So most of my afternoon is going to be working with the 3D printers.
Customer orders, customers being people who are purchasing what exactly?
Oh, GRIDSCAPE.
GRIDSCAPE. Tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Sure. 2018, we had a Kickstarter for a terrain system that attaches to pegboard. Basically, pegboard uses the same 1-inch scale that all of our role-playing games use. And so at some point I figured out that if you create a terrain system with pegs that attaches to a pegboard, you can create really detailed maps. And so the Kickstarter was successful. I'm now a business, Battleboard Games, and much of my product is 3D printed, but the main parts are plastic injection molded.
Yeah. So what he's explaining, guys, is a mobile terrain system for your tabletop role-playing games. Go to battleboardgames.com and you'll be able to see exactly what Logan's talking about. It's a really super fun and easy to build tabletop battle map. That's 3-dimensional, literally. Perfect for your minis. It creates great visuals. I have a set myself. They're very affordable. And when I set up games at my place and I have like my little brother over and we do like one-on-one games, I have all the maps already done. The pegboards are all set up and I just have them hidden underneath the dining room table. And then when he's getting ready to go into the counter, I say roll initiative and he already gets excited. And then I go under the table, I pull this map up and I throw it on the table and he freaks out. His eyes bulge out of his head. It's a blast. So definitely recommend you guys check that out. Yeah, man, again, I can't thank you enough for all your time. And for being a good friend and a good player and a great DM and a sage of wisdom to help me and others. So thank you so much, sir.
Hey, keep it up. I'm really enjoying these videos of yours.
Excellent. Most certainly. I love the support and the inspiration for sure. So signing off, guys, this is Richard Darshwood and Logan. I'm with Initiative Roles, and where we like to remind people that adventure grows from the roots of spontaneity. So keep collaborating with your friends and making some really cool stuff happen that you never even knew that were completely unexpected before you got together. That's what it's all about. So keep playing, keep rolling 20s, and we'll see you guys back here some other time. Enjoy your Sunday, sir. I'll see you in a few hours.
Yeah.
Cool.